Welcome to the English with Kirsty podcast from www.englishwithkirsty.com. Here I'll be sharing with you tips, information and other learning resources so that you can improve your business English. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 60 of the English with Kirsty podcast. And this week I have an interview for you. It's especially for the listeners who are in France or the French speakers this week, because I'm talking to Cara Leopold, who has loads of good information and resources, particularly for French speakers. So make sure that you have a look at the show notes as well, because there are resources and links and things that we didn't speak about that will be in the show notes. So have a look at those if you're interested. And also you'll find out where there's why there's a picture of two big tongues on my show notes page if you go and have a look at them. But this isn't just for French speakers, it's also for anyone really who's interested in listening, because listening is so important both for understanding what other people are saying and for being understood yourself. So if you're interested in listening, this episode is also for you. So I hope you enjoy the episode, and if you want to look at the show notes, you'll find them at www.englishwithkirsty.com/podcast/episode 60. Well, firstly, thank you for joining us on the podcast. I learnt a bit of French at school. I passed the exams and everything, but I've forgotten everything since. So it would be really good if you could firstly tell us what are some of the main differences between English and French.
Okay, well, at the moment this is kind of timely because I'm still working my way through a book called On y soit qui mal y pense, which is a book about kind of the history of French and English and how the two languages have influenced each other over the centuries. Because it's worth remembering that before 1066 and all that, so before the Norman conquest, English was more like German, because of the influence of the Anglo-Saxons. And in fact, the way that English looks and is spelt, not so much how it sounds, but certainly how it looks and is spelt is mainly due to this influence of French over the centuries. So I actually think there are quite a lot of surprising similarities between the two languages, especially in vocabulary, but we'll get to that in a little bit. So for me, you could argue that the tenses are tricky for French speakers learning English. But really, I think that the big pain point between the two languages for English people learning French or French people learning English is the phonology of the two languages. And so that's interesting to me because obviously that poses problems with regard to listening. So, a big problem for French speakers learning English is going to be adapting to word and sentence stress in English, because in French you don't have unstressed syllables and words. You don't have these weak forms like we have in English. So every word and in a sentence, every syllable is going to be stressed equally.
Okay.
And so that's a particular problem on words that are cognates, words that look the same and mean the same, but the pronunciation is going to be very different between the two languages. So maybe in the written form you can recognize these words easily, but when you hear them as a French speaker learning English, you might be a bit shocked and you're going to probably have trouble pronouncing them, even though these are words that you recognize. And I think even for me, I've been living in France for 9 years, and I think I've almost got rid of all traces of my British accent when I speak, but I still think there's this issue of kind of melody and intonation that people can kind of hear in the background that I can never really get rid of. I'll never really have that nice kind of flat French intonation. So for me, these phonological differences to do with intonation and stress, for me, that's the biggest issue, and that poses problems to do with listening and pronunciation, as I've mentioned.
Okay, so in terms of French speakers who are learning English, would you say that there are any particular sounds that are difficult for them, either when listening to other people speaking or when speaking English themselves?
Well, there are a couple of minimal pairs that pose problems. Well, I mean, they pose problems for speakers of other languages too. So that's going to be differences like the difference between the I in ship and the E in sheep. So in French, you have this long E sound, but that kind of weak I doesn't exist. So that's going to pose problems for listening and for speaking, for distinguishing between pairs like the ship-sheep example. Another minimal pair that can cause problems is pull and pool. I'm pronouncing it in a French way. pull and pool, because that kind of medium vowel, also the sound like in bird. These kinds of median vowels don't exist in French. And there's also a tendency with the diphthongs pose less problems. So like, I like in bike or a like in paper are less of an issue, but then the problem that happens in pronunciation is French people tend to kind of over pronounce the diphthongs.
Okay.
So that can be
sound natural.
Yeah, so it does sound that might also be related maybe to issues of word stress as well that I mentioned. So there's that to do with vowels, and then I actually kind of noted down more issues with consonant sounds. So like the h, like in house, doesn't exist in French. Well, not in the same way. So generally it gets omitted, or it might be like added and overpronounced when it's not required. So in a word like hour or honest, French people will, kind of overpronounce a h sound when in fact it's not actually pronounced in the word. And then there's the th sound, like in words like think. So that's an issue for French speakers. There's also the ch sound. So for distinguishing, for example, the words choose and shoes can be tricky because French people they only have the sh. So there are plenty of words in French that begin with ch, and they're pronounced sh and not ch. And I think the only time in English that we pronounce ch, the letters at the beginning of a word, as sh is when it's words borrowed from French. So like chandelier. But otherwise words like church, chocolate, that can pose problems because the tendency of French speakers will be to pronounce that as sh. There's also the r sound, which is, well, I think that's difficult for everybody. Most people learning English. And I was actually looking again at, a really interesting, presentation by a guy called Pierce Messam. I wanted to say Pierre, but it's Pierce Messam. And he was talking about like, the articulatory setting in French and English. So that, I know that sounds scary and complicated, but it's just kind of to do with the way that the default position of your tongue as a French speaker versus an English speaker. So in fact, in English, your tongue is kind of automatically set so that it's the back of the tongue kind of touches your molars and the tip of it is pulled back. Whereas in French, your tongue is more kind of taut and it kind of touches the tip touches your teeth. And that actually impacts on the ability of French speakers to pronounce sounds like the r, or to pronounce, for example, p or t with aspiration. Because in French, in fact, it's the blade of your tongue that hits your alveolar ridge. Whereas in English, it's the tip of the tongue. And that's all to do with kind of the articulatory setting in your mouth. So I thought that was really interesting. I remember when I first saw that, I was like, wow, that's a really important thing to kind of know how to teach or explain to French speakers, and speakers of other languages, because in many other languages, the blade of the tongue is what's used more often than the tip. In English, it's the tip that is constantly, hitting the alveolar ridge to make sounds like t, d, l, etc. In terms of pronunciation, there are quite a lot of issues, and for me teaching listening, it can be problematic because people are maybe, expecting one pronunciation according to the spelling, and then perhaps have trouble decoding they're hearing because they're not expecting it to sound that way.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that, so I've learnt something as well today. Finally, I was just wondering if you could give us a couple of examples of either false friends or words which are good, because they're the same in both languages.
Okay, well, there are lots and lots of false friends. I just grabbed some of the most common ones earlier. So, for example, the English word cave exists in French, and it's pronounced cave. And so that is actually a cellar in French, and the French word for cave is grotte.
Okay, so completely different.
It's completely different, yeah. There's also, I suppose you might remember this one from school. So une librairie in French is a bookshop. And obviously that looks like library in English, which is bibliothèque in French.
Okay.
What else is there? In French there's the word sensible. So it's not sensible, it's sensitive.
Oh, it's like in German. That's interesting.
Oh, is it? Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, so that's, a few of the most common ones. And then, as I mentioned, I'm reading this book, which is about how French and English have influenced each other over the centuries. And in this book, there's a list of over 3,000, not false friends, but I guess good friends. So that's a list of words that look the same and the meaning is the same. But what I think is a shame is that this is a written list, and for me it would be fantastic if it existed as a spoken list, because, obviously these words in writing, as we were saying earlier, they're going to pose, no issue when they are pure, good friends. But the problem is going to come, as I said, when a French speaker learning English is going to hear how these words actually sound and and will be a bit shocked. If you take a word like communication. So in French, that's pronounced communication. So we've got, all the syllables are evenly stressed. You've got this ION ending in French, which is also always pronounced yon, communication. So that's something I really struggled with when I first came to France, because I was pronouncing it like this. I was saying communication. I was transferring the pronunciation of ION in English to French, so in English that's a weak syllable in that word, that you've got a schwa in between the consonant sounds. It sounds very, very different, and it comes back to these issues of intonation and stress that I mentioned. So while I think it's fantastic that because the two languages have influenced each other so much, we do have these lists of words that you can learn if you're a French speaker learning English. That's great, but then you're going to have to take the time to, learn, okay, so how is this word stressed? Are there any difficult sounds that I don't know how to pronounce? What sounds are different from, French? That written form ION, okay, that's pronounced in quite a regular way, but but in English it's very different to French. So I think there's while there's a definite advantage there, if you are French and you're learning English, you really need to take the time to kind of discover, the phonological side of things, the sound side of things, because otherwise, listening and pronunciation are going to be, a real problem for you.
So that's true. Even though these words can be your friends because you're familiar with them, it can be a problem if you don't pronounce them properly, or if when you're listening to other people you don't recognize them when you hear them being said. So in a way these words are good, but you also do have to be careful if there are some differences in the pronunciation.
And I think that can be really frustrating. So there are definitely intelligibility issues that can come up because you're pronouncing it in a French way. You're trying to stress all the syllables. You're not replacing the French vowels with the ones we would use in English. And so, that can definitely be frustrating because you're thinking to yourself, well, I know this word, this person should know this word, it's understandable in both languages, but that's where, pronunciation and listening can definitely pose problems. So I'm all for lists of, like these with words that, kind of mean the same and are spelled the same, but, what would be fantastic is to have an audio version of that, and then, then you would really understand the pronunciation differences between the two.
So thanks for that, both for the information you've shared there and for the extra information that you've sent me, and I will add that to the show notes page. So especially for French speakers who are learning English, come and have a look at the show notes because you'll find some extra links there. And thanks again for coming on the podcast, and have a good week everyone, and have fun learning English.
Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the English with Kirsty podcast. If you have any questions or comments, my email address is kirsty@englishwithkirsty.com, or you can go to www.englishwithkirsty.com/podcast, where you'll find information about the individual episodes.